for long-term chemical management of chronic conditions like ADHD. And we're doing this operating in a pretty highly stressed environment, right? Marked by sustained systemic instability and, frankly, extreme personal performance demands. It places immense pressure on individuals just trying to maintain consistent functional output.
And that pressure cooker environment is, I think, precisely why we have to ask some difficult questions about the nature of reliance itself.
Indeed. So our central question today is, does the necessity of chronic chemical intervention for ADHD, typically involving prescribed stimulants, does it functionally blur the distinction between rigorous clinical management and, let's say, conscious self-medication with alternative or even illicit substances? I mean, after all, both pathways in practice seem to serve as long-term external supports for sustained function.
Right. And I'm arguing that when function is the ultimate metric, the functional equivalency is actually quite striking. And it suggests we really need to look deeper at the system, the structure that compels this reliance in the first place.
And I'll be arguing that despite any, superficial functional overlap, the fundamental neurobiological harms, coupled with the, frankly, essential absence of ethical and legal safeguards in self-medication, render these two options categorically distinct, unequal, really. The distinction between managed support and unmitigated risk is, well, it's everything.
Okay, but I come at it from a different angle. For me, the core issue is that both options represent a chronic external reliance. It's necessary to force a, let's call it, high-variety brain into a low-variety state of productivity that society demands. So the deeper failure, I think, lies in the rigidity of those demands, not always just the source of the chemical support.
Well, I hear this structural critique. It's compelling, sure, but I worry it distracts us from the immediate and potentially catastrophic risk to the individual. Let's start with the clinical reality. The framework of prescribed medicine is fundamentally defined by the principle of do no harm. Now, that ethical imperative immediately distinguishes regulated treatment from self-medication, which poses catastrophic, unregulated risks. I mean, overdose, unknown contaminants, self-harm. We know the high comorbidity. Up to half of adults with ADHD will experience a substance use disorder at some point. This points to self-medication not as some viable alternative, but as a high-risk, often maladaptive coping mechanism driven by the underlying condition itself.
Okay, I see why you emphasize that risk data, but we have to remember those statistics are largely drawn from clinical populations, right? These are often people whose self-medication failed them and required external intervention. For the individual navigating this high-demand world, especially right now, I mean, facing stimulant shortages, the high expense, complex regulatory barriers that make accessing reliable clinical care extremely precarious for many, the choice isn't always between pure health and pure harm. Sometimes it feels more like it's about daily survival. The prescribed option relying on consistent, chronic, often lifelong stimulant use still fundamentally represents an external solution to a chronic internal issue. The person is often desperately seeking reliable state control, that, fleeting, inconsistent moment of focused brilliance, the bottled lightning that our society rewards so heavily.
But that temporary pursuit of bottled lightning, as you call it, it comes at an unacceptable neurobiological cost, a cost that regulated treatment actively attempts to mitigate. Our source material is pretty clear on this. Chronic reliance on unregulated substances for motivation is structurally counterproductive. You might feel a short-term boost, sure, but you are actively disabling the basal ganglia. That's the neural circuitry crucial for developing long-term, self-regulated habits.
Wait, let's make that clear for the listener. What does disabling the basal ganglia actually mean for daily life, like functionally?
Functionally? Okay. It means you are essentially trading tomorrow's self-driving car for today's high-speed scooter. You actively undermine your capacity for sustained self-mastery. So instead of building the internal machinery for motivation, the ability to start tasks autonomously, to follow through, you become reliant on external, high-intensity stimuli, which can include the chaos of the substance use itself. The temporary relief is offset by long-term neural impairment and, Crucially, the structural worsening of core ADHD symptoms over time. Clinical treatment, conversely, aims to support executive function so that those internal habits can hopefully form. That's the critical distinction in intent and ultimately outcome.
That's a compelling argument, and I absolutely acknowledge the neurobiological risks, especially the potential costs to true internal habit formation. However, we have to consider the immediate reality of the high-variety ADHD brain. Performance for many relies heavily on an alterable state, not necessarily fixed traits like motivation or discipline, which might be neurotypical assumptions. And critically, this brain often struggles profoundly with temporal discounting.
Can you elaborate on temporal discounting in this context? What does that look like?
Certainly. So, temporal discounting is where a future reward feels far greater than an immediate gain. You know, the $100 you get right now feels maybe 10 times more valuable than the promise of $1,000 next year. For the ADHD brain, that future payoff, that internal durable habit you're talking about, it can be discounted almost to zero in the face of immediate pressure or immediate relief. Therefore, external state regulation becomes, or at least feels like, a necessary force to achieve functionality now. When function is the immediate goal, and internal regulation is perceived as a distant, perhaps unreachable ideal, the difference between prescribed stimulants and self-medication can often collapse into simply a difference of legality, access, and expense, not a fundamental difference in relying on a chemical crutch.
I'm just not convinced that the immediacy of need negates the severity of the structural damage. I mean, if self-medication disables the neurological infrastructure for self-mastery, doesn't it essentially lock the individual into a cycle of increased reliance? We know substances like chronic alcohol or marijuana use, for instance, reduce REM sleep quality, and the misuse of stimulants, even prescribed ones if misused, will likely worsen executive dysfunction in the long run. Isn't that structurally guaranteeing long-term instability? The success you sometimes claim to see in self-medication often looks more like a desperate short-term coping mechanism that, eventually, causes profound self-sabotage, regardless of any temporary perceived gain.
But this is exactly where the systemic failure becomes, well, unavoidable, isn't it? If your environment, your job security, your financial necessity demands immediate, chemically assisted peak performance, then the long-term ideal of slow internal habit formation might feel effectively irrelevant, almost like a luxury. The ADHD brain, interestingly, is often uniquely adapted to perform better under extreme external pressure and chaos, what our source material sometimes calls damage control. So external state regulation isn't just a failure of internal discipline. It can be a chaotic but necessary strategy to achieve functionality when the rigid system requires speed and consistency that the natural brain just cannot reliably provide on demand.
Okay, that brings us directly to the psychological engine often driving this choice. The impetus for self-medication, as the research suggests, frequently stems from intense psychological shame and emotional dysregulation, specifically things like rejection sensitivity dysphoria or RSD. The substance use then becomes a form of emotion-focused coping. It's about managing the fear of failure, managing the shame, rather than problem-solving the external task deficiency itself.
I agree that RSD and shame are incredibly powerful drivers, and the chaos that results from failure is destructive. Absolutely.
And this type of emotion-focused coping, we know, is empirically linked to poor long-term outcomes precisely because it manages the internal emotional state without actually fixing the external problem. It's often a trajectory toward collapse.
But let's follow that chain of validation for a moment. The resulting chaos, while harmful, can paradoxically be validating because the ADHD brain often excels in that high-intensity environment